I'm not proud of this, and I'm not asking for absolution. I'm just tired of carrying it around alone. If this were Reddit, I'd probably throw it under r/confessions or life stories and hit post at 2 a.m., hoping strangers might read it and somehow make it lighter. My name's William. I'm older now, steadier, but there was a long stretch of my life where I made decisions based on panic and ego instead of sense. One of those decisions happened at a gas station off a state highway, the kind of place you only stop at because you're low on fuel and lower on options. That crime didn't look like much from the outside, but it rippled outward in ways I couldn't predict, and it changed me more than any other bad thing I did. At the time, I was broke in the truest sense, not just financially, but mentally. I'd been juggling debt, a job I was about to lose, and this constant hum of resentment that everyone else seemed to be getting ahead while I was stuck treading water. I told myself I deserved a break. I told myself I wasn't a bad person, just a desperate one. That kind of thinking is dangerous, but it felt logical back then. The gas station wasn't chosen because it was special. It was chosen because it was familiar. I'd stopped there dozens of times, memorized the rhythm of the place without realizing it. I knew the faces, the slow hours, the way the night seemed to stretch thinner there. I didn't wake up that day planning to cross a line, but by the time I pulled into the lot, something in me had already decided. This is the story of that decision, and everything that followed. Looking back, the scariest part isn't what I did, it's how reasonable it felt at the time. I had this internal courtroom going where I was both the defendant and the judge, and somehow I kept ruling in my own favor. I was drowning in bills. Credit cards maxed, rent late, my car making a noise that sounded expensive. I'd just gotten a final warning email from my boss about attendance, even though I'd been missing work because my head felt like it was full of static all the time. Every problem fed the next one. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat right, couldn't think past the end of the week. I started noticing things at that gas station I never consciously clocked before. How there was usually only one employee late at night. How the security cameras looked ancient, like props more than protection. How the parking lot emptied out after midnight except for the occasional trucker. I didn't think, I'm going to commit a crime. I thought, if something happened here, it wouldn't even matter. That's the lie I told myself, that it was small, victimless, temporary. That I'd fix everything after. That this would be the one bad thing I'd do to set my life straight. I remember sitting in my car one night across the street, engine off, watching the fluorescent lights buzz inside, and feeling this weird calm settle over me. I wish I could say I hesitated because of morality. Truth is, I hesitated because I was afraid of getting caught. Once I convinced myself I was smart enough not to, the rest fell into place disturbingly fast. Preparation didn't look like blueprints or checklists. It looked like rationalizing. I kept telling myself I was just being observant, just paying attention to my surroundings like anyone would. But deep down, I knew I was rehearsing. I started timing my visits. Not with a stopwatch or anything obvious, just mental notes. When the shift changed. When the place was busiest, when it went dead quiet. I noticed how the clerk leaned on the counter when bored, how he scrolled his phone between customers, how the bell over the door sounded louder at night. Every little detail felt important, like my brain was hoarding them for later. I cleaned out my car more than usual. Threw away receipts, old cups, anything that might tie a timeline together. That should have been a red flag to myself, but instead it felt like getting my life in order. I even dressed differently, nothing dramatic, just more generic. Jeans, hoodie, shoes that didn't stand out. I told myself it was coincidence, but it wasn't. The weirdest part was how normal everything else felt. I still laughed at dumb videos, still talked to friends, still complained about money like I hadn't already started down a darker path. There was this split inside me, one version of William going through the motions of daily life, and another quietly preparing to cross a line he couldn't uncross. The night it finally happened, I didn't feel like a criminal. I felt like someone about to take a test he hadn't studied for but was convinced he could pass anyway. I sat in my car longer than I needed to. Engine idling, radio off, hands resting on the steering wheel like I was waiting for permission from something that wasn't coming. The gas station looked exactly the same as it always had. Too bright, too quiet, floating in the dark like it existed outside the rest of the world. My heart was doing this annoying thing where it couldn't decide whether to sprint or stall. Dry mouth. Sweaty palms. That surge of adrenaline people talk about. It's real, but it's messy. It doesn't make you sharp. It makes you jittery and stupid and overly confident all at once. I remember thinking, if I leave now, this all goes away. That was probably my last clean exit. Instead, I told myself I'd already come too far, even though too far was just sitting in a parking lot. Funny how we turn hesitation into obligation when it suits us. I pulled my hood up more out of habit than strategy. Checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized myself, not because I looked scary, but because I looked blank. Like I'd already switched something off inside. When I opened the car door, the cold air hit me hard. The bell over the gas station door rang as soon as I stepped inside, louder than I expected, and for a split second I almost turned around. The clerk looked up, bored expression snapping into polite alertness. That was it. No dramatic music. No slow motion. Just me, standing there, pretending to browse snacks while my brain screamed that whatever I did next would follow me for the rest of my life. I wish I could say it happened fast, like ripping off a bandage. It didn't. It dragged. Every second inside that gas station felt stretched thin, like the air itself was watching me. I grabbed something cheap off the shelf, gum, I think, just to look normal. My ears were ringing, and I became hyper-aware of everything, the hum of the refrigerators, the faint smell of burned coffee, the way the clerk's eyes flicked back to his phone when he thought I wasn't paying attention. He trusted the routine. I counted on that more than anything. When I finally acted, it didn't feel bold. It felt clumsy. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. The clerk's confusion hit first, then realization. That shift in his face, that's the part that still sneaks into my dreams sometimes. Not fear yet, just disbelief that this was happening here, to him, on an ordinary night. Things didn't go exactly how I'd imagined in my head. My hands shook. I dropped something. The clerk hesitated longer than I expected, and for a terrifying moment I thought he might push back or run or yell. Instead, he froze, eyes wide, breathing shallow. That silence was heavier than shouting would have been. A customer pulled into the lot right then. Headlights swept across the windows, and my stomach dropped. I remember thinking, this is it. This is where everything collapses. The clerk noticed too. We both did. We shared this awful, unspoken understanding that the situation had just gotten more dangerous for everyone involved. I took what I came for and backed away, never turning my back, heart hammering so hard I thought it might knock me over. When I pushed the door open and the bell rang again, it sounded almost mocking. I didn't run. I walked, fast, stiff, trying to look like someone who belonged there. The car doors slammed shut behind me, and only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I pulled out of the lot way too fast, tires chirping just enough to make my heart leap into my throat. That was my first mistake after the fact. Panic always wants to show itself. I forced myself to slow down, to obey the speed limit like my life depended on it, because in a way it did. The world felt unreal, like someone had turned the saturation down. Streetlights smeared into long yellow lines. My hands were still shaking on the wheel, and I kept flexing my fingers like I could shake the feeling out of them. Every car behind me felt like a police cruiser. Every turn felt suspicious, even though I took the most boring, ordinary route home. I replayed everything immediately. The dropped item. The headlights. The clerk's face. My brain latched onto every tiny imperfection and blew it up into evidence that I'd already been identified, that alarms were blaring somewhere I couldn't hear. I checked my mirrors obsessively, convinced I'd see red and blue lights any second. When I finally parked, I just sat there. Engine off. Darkness pressing in. The adrenaline didn't fade, it curdled. I felt sick, like I might throw up, like my skin didn't fit right anymore. This was the part one hadn't planned for, the silence after, when there's no action left to distract you from what you've done. I went inside and hid what I'd taken, hands still unsteady, then washed them for way too long. I kept expecting to see something on my skin, dirt, guilt, proof, but of course there was nothing. Just me, staring at my reflection, trying to reconcile the person I thought I was with the person who had just walked out of a gas station and driven away from a crime. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the bell over the door ringing again. The next few days were worse than the night itself. I'd always imagined the aftermath of a crime as either immediate consequences or clean escape. What I got instead was waiting, long, quiet, corrosive waiting. Every sound outside my apartment made my pulse spike. Sirens in the distance felt personal. A knock on a neighbor's door sent me into full-body tension, like I was bracing for impact. I checked the news obsessively, scrolling through local crime reports with a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. When I didn't see anything about the gas station, I didn't feel relief. I felt suspicion. Like the silence meant something bigger was coming. I replayed my own behavior over and over, searching for cracks. Did I act strange afterward? Did I say something to someone without realizing it? I found myself overcompensating, being extra friendly, extra normal. That fake normalcy was exhausting. It felt like holding a smile during a cramp. The guilt crept in sideways. Not as some dramatic moral awakening, but in small, invasive thoughts. I'd be standing in line somewhere and suddenly picture the clerk's face again, the way his routine night had been shattered. I started avoiding that part of town entirely, like geography itself could accuse me. I told myself stories to cope. That he was fine. That the company would absorb the loss. That worse things happened every day. Sometimes those lies worked for a few minutes. Sometimes they collapsed immediately, leaving me alone with the fact that I'd changed someone else's life without their consent. The worst part? A piece of me felt relieved I hadn't been caught. That realization scared me more than the crime itself. About a week after, the gas station showed up in my life again, uninvited. Not in handcuffs or flashing lights, worse. In conversation. I was at work when someone mentioned it offhand, like gossip. "Did you hear about that gas station off Route 6? My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might pass out right there between the printer and the coffee machine. I tried to keep my face neutral, like I didn't already know exactly which one they meant. They said the clerk had quit. Just walked out mid-shift a few days later and never came back. Said he couldn't sleep anymore, kept replaying it in his head. Management was scrambling to cover nights. No one used the word trauma, but it hung in the air anyway. That's when it really hit me that this wasn't just something that happened to me. It had continued happening after I left. I'd driven home and obsessed over my own fear while he'd gone home and tried to convince himself the world was still predictable. I hadn't planned for that part, the echo. I started justifying again, reflexively. I told myself people quit jobs all the time. That I hadn't physically hurt anyone. That I couldn't control how someone reacted. Each excuse landed weaker than the last, like paper shields against something solid and heavy. That night, I almost went back. Not to confess, don't give me that much credit, but to look. To see the place again, to confirm it still existed, that the lights still turned on. I circled the block twice before realizing how insane that urge was and drove away instead, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. For the first time since it happened, I wasn't just afraid of getting caught. I was afraid of who I'd proven myself capable of being. After that conversation at work, I went into damage control mode, not externally, but internally. I decided I was done being that version of myself. As if you could just shut a door like that and move on. I threw myself into routines. gym before work, cooking instead of takeout, saying yes to things I'd usually avoid. On the surface, it probably looked like a self-improvement arc. Inside, it felt more like hiding in plain sight. If I stayed busy enough, maybe I wouldn't think about the gas station. Maybe I wouldn't think about the clerk waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, the same way I did. I even convinced myself I'd learned my lesson. That the fear and guilt were punishment enough. That I was balanced again. But guilt doesn't vanish, it waits. It shows up when you're tired, when you're quiet, when you least expect it. A bell over a door. A fluorescent light flickering. A bored cashier glancing up. I caught myself scanning exits wherever I went. Watching people's hands. Not out of paranoia anymore, but recognition. That was another blow, realizing I now understood how fragile those everyday interactions really are, because I'd been the threat once. I told no one. Not friends, not family, not even in vague terms. This story lived entirely in my head, where it grew heavier with each day. I started to realize that getting away with something doesn't mean escaping it. Sometimes it just means you're the one who has to carry it forever. And deep down, I knew the story wasn't over yet. Consequences don't always rush in. Sometimes they take their time, making sure they arrive when you're finally starting to believe you're safe. The thing about believing you're safe is that it makes you sloppy in a different way. Not careless, just less prepared for reality to tap you on the shoulder. A couple of months after the gas station, I got pulled over. Routine traffic stop. Broken taillight, apparently. The officer was polite, almost bored, which somehow made it worse. As he walked back to his car with my license, my chest tightened so fast it felt like a physical blow. I was convinced this was it. That somewhere in some system, my name would trigger something. That he'd come back differently, more alert, hand resting near his belt, voice firmer. I started mentally rehearsing explanations I didn't need yet, my thoughts spiraling into worst-case scenarios. While I waited, I noticed how loud my heartbeat was in my ears. How my foot bounced uncontrollably. How the night air smelled exactly like it had outside that gas station. Cold, faintly chemical. I realized then how deeply that moment had wired itself into me. My body remembered even when my mind tried to move on. The officer came back, handed me a warning, and told me to get the light fixed. That was it. No questions. No suspicion. He walked away like I was just another guy on the road. I thanked him, probably too quickly, and drove off shaking. I had to pull over a few blocks later just to breathe. Relief washed over me, sharp and dizzying, followed immediately by shame. Because part of me felt lucky. And part of me hated myself for feeling that way. That traffic stop didn't bring consequences, but it stripped away the illusion that I could ever relax again. I understood then that even if no one else ever connected the dots, my nervous system already had. I'd sentenced myself to a quieter kind of punishment, one that showed up at random, without warning. And I was starting to suspect it might last longer than anything a court could give me. After the traffic stop, my old justification stopped working. The neat little stories I'd built, no one got hurt, it was just money, I'm not that guy, they started sounding hollow, like rehearsed lines instead of truths. I noticed it in small moments. When I'd complain about unfairness at work and feel this immediate, bitter irony clamp down on me. When friends would talk about being scared at night, and I'd go quiet, suddenly aware of which side of fear I'd stood on before. I became allergic to my own excuses. I tried to reframe it as growth. People mess up, learn, move forward, right? But learning implies some kind of repair, and I hadn't repaired anything. I just avoided consequences and slapped a coat of self-awareness over the mess. That realization sat heavy in my chest. There were nights I'd imagine alternate versions of that evening. Ones where I left the parking lot before going in. Ones where I walked up to the counter and just paid for gas like a normal person. Those versions of me felt like strangers, men who slept better, breathed easier, didn't flinch at sirens. I also started wondering about the clerk more often. Not in a voyeuristic way, but with this gnawing curiosity about the long tail of what I'd done. Did he find another job? Did he trust people again? Did he tell the story, or did he keep it locked up the way I did? That's when I realized the crime hadn't just changed my circumstances, it had changed my sense of time. Everything was now split into before and after. And no matter how far I walked forward, I was still dragging that line behind me. There was a night I came dangerously close to telling someone. Not the police, don't romanticize me, but a friend I trusted, someone who'd known me long enough to hear the cracks when my voice tried to sound normal. We were sitting on his back porch, beers going warm between us, talking about nothing important. He mentioned how weird it was that people could just snap, how you never really knew what someone was capable of. He laughed when he said it. I didn't. My mouth opened before my brain agreed to it. I felt the words lining up, heavy and hot, like they'd burn on the way out. I imagined saying it plainly. I did something bad. I scared someone. I can't undo it. I imagined the look on his face, confusion first, then recalibration. The moment where I'd stop being just William and start being a problem. I swallowed it instead. Changed the subject. Made a joke. The relief was immediate and disgusting. Relief at staying hidden. Relief at not having to face the version of myself that existed outside my own head. That night drove something home for me. Secrecy isn't just a consequence of wrongdoing, it becomes a habit. A skill. You learn how to compartmentalize, how to present a clean surface while the mess stays sealed underneath. And the longer you do it, the harder it is to imagine living any other way. I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, realizing that confession wasn't just about consequences. It was about surrendering control of the narrative. As long as I stayed silent, I could still pretend I understood what I'd done. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. So I stayed quiet. And the story stayed trapped with me. Time kept moving, because it always does, but it didn't move evenly. Weeks would pass where I almost felt normal again, where the gas station receded into something hazy and distant. Then something small would yank it back into focus. It could be nothing, a late-night stop for gas, a bell over a door, a clerk who looked too young to be working alone. My body reacted before my thoughts did. Tight chest. Shallow breath. This reflexive awareness of how exposed everyone really was. I started avoiding certain places, certain hours, without consciously deciding to. My life narrowed in quiet, unremarkable ways. What surprised me was how the memory changed shape. At first, it was sharp and specific, sounds, faces, timing. Later, it became heavier but blurrier, like a bruise you don't touch but always feel. The fear of getting caught faded a little. The understanding of what I'd done didn't. I realized something uncomfortable during this period. The world hadn't punished me. There was no cosmic balancing act, no dramatic reckoning. The clerk quit, the gas station stayed open, and I kept waking up in my own bed. That absence of justice felt like an accusation in itself. I started questioning who accountability was really for. The law? Society? Or the part of you that needs to believe you're not just drifting through life leaving damage in your wake? Without consequences, I had to decide whether the person I wanted to be was defined by what I got away with or by what I chose never to do again. That question followed me everywhere. And I didn't have a good answer yet. I didn't wake up one day redeemed. There was no turning point where I paid some invisible debt and felt balanced again. What happened instead was quieter and slower. I started making decisions with that night in mind. I stopped cutting corners, not out of virtue, but out of fear of recognizing myself again. Fear that if I let one small thing slide, I'd remember how easy it was to justify the next. I became almost rigid about certain lines. People probably thought I'd grown up, mellowed out, gotten serious. In a way, I had. I'd seen what lived on the other side of just this once. I also stopped telling myself I was a good person by default. That idea used to comfort me. Now it felt lazy. I started thinking in terms of behavior instead of identity. I wasn't good or bad, I was capable. Capable of harm. Capable of restraint. That shift was uncomfortable, but it was honest. There were moments I considered doing something tangible, donating anonymously, volunteering, anything that might feel like counterweight. Some of that helped. None of it erased the original act. I had to accept that growth doesn't work like a ledger. The gas station still exists. I know because I've driven past it. I don't stop. I don't need to. It's no longer about fear of recognition. It's about respect, for the people inside, and for the version of myself I don't want to resurrect. By the time years had passed, I understood something I wish I'd known earlier. The worst part of that crime wasn't the risk I took. It was the certainty it gave me about my own capacity to choose wrong when it felt convenient. That knowledge never goes away. You just learn how to live with it. If there's a takeaway here, it's not a heroic moral. There's no neat lesson that makes the risk worth it. But I can tell you what it did teach me, painfully, slowly, and relentlessly. First, your choices echo farther than you think. The gas station was small, the amount I took trivial, but the impact on the clerk, on me, on the mental space I occupy, lasted years. Don't kid yourself into thinking it's nothing. It never is. Second, getting away doesn't equal freedom. You might escape the law, the arrest, even the confrontation, but you carry it inside you. The guilt, the adrenaline, the anxiety, they're quieter than sirens but heavier. You trade one kind of risk for a lifelong tension you can't negotiate. Third, secrecy becomes a cage. I never confessed. I tried, a few times, almost did, but the story stayed locked inside me. That's the cost of self-preservation. You don't get relief, you get expertise in hiding from yourself. Fourth, you can't undo the past, but you can influence the future. I didn't become a saint. I still screw up. But I choose my actions more deliberately now, because I know what it feels like to wake up one day realizing the damage you've caused is part of you forever. If you're thinking about crossing a line, ask yourself not what you'll get, but what you'll never shake. The thrill fades fast. The consequences, internal or external, do not. I'm William, and that's the story of the gas station. I'm not looking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to put it into words in the hope that someone, somewhere, reads it and thinks twice before stepping into the shoes I wore that night.